Greetings to Borowski. The other day I was listening to a libertarian on the radio debating the need for public assistance programs. After first laughing off the perception that he was a cold-hearted son of a bitch for holding such views, he then whipped out a quote from that fount of bourgeois social wisdom, Benjamin Franklin. I am for doing good to the poor, but I think the best way of doing good to the poor is not making them easy in poverty, but leading or driving them out of it. I observed that the more public provisions were made for the poor, the less they provided for themselves, and of course became poorer. And on the contrary, the less was done for them, the more they did for themselves and became richer. After all, Ben's face is all over the USC note, the universal global currency of the globe, so it's got to be true, right? Well, Tuberovsky, let's take a look and see if it's more than just smug platitude. If there's more to that than an American echo of class war analogous to Marie Antoinette's famous let them eat shit or something like that. Ben and his followers are taking for granted their middle-class status in a middle-class society. In other words, a society where all are more or less equal, have certain basic political rights, have individual independence, and thus only their strength of character stands between them and riches, however conceived. But as we look around the world, at our own society too, we see the basic ingredients for such confidence often have little or no foundation. Ben's advice surely can't be an axiom for action for real individuals in the real world. In Ben's time, could his advice have had any meaning for a slave? What did the slave's energy and thrift profit him when the fruits were appropriated by his master? When the labor, the time, the earnings, the very life of one are themselves the property of another, Franklin's advice loses all substantive meaning. To go to a Carolina plantation and preach his gospel in the slave quarters would have been an insulting absurdity because its workers lacked any means of independence, of personhood and property on which to capitalize. Is it that much different in a modern ghetto? The slave's descendant is a freeman, a free man if you will, in his personhood, yet this legal status has too often been denied in the practice of those who hold economic power as employers or political power as judges and legislators. The ghetto dweller who cries racism is seen by Franklinites as making excuses for his continued poverty, caused by his own character defects. Yet segregation, disfranchisement, and biased law enforcement were not created by self-excusing lazy welfare bums to justify their independency, now were they? The problem with Franklinite philosophy is that it addresses dependence on public charity, but not the issue of dependence itself. To Franklin, it's a sin to be dependent on the public treasury, but quite all right to be dependent on private capital. The worker who comes petitioning the owner of a print shop for employment at wages is a dependent as much as the slave. To Franklin, the difference lies in that his employee comes to him willingly and is paid a wage. But it's quite proper for Ben to set the terms of work, the conditions of work, and determine its value and hence the amount it's worth in money reward. There is no autonomy on the job, even if there is legal autonomy for the worker in his political status as citizen. With the worker's worth determined by another, who has every vested interest in keeping him poor and dependent on wages, and on pushing him out the door as a cost when he's not needed, it's no surprise that capital accumulation, that is wealth, is beyond any real grasp of said employee. The inequality of economic status between worker and employer precludes Franklin's advice from any real-world meaning. When we see how capitalism works outside the white first world too, in El Salvador, South Africa, or Egypt, this scenario is too obvious for comment. The dependency is too flagrant, the gutting of political rights so egregious. It's obvious that apartheid and death squads are necessary to create capital accumulation until this accumulation reaches the point where the economic gap in personal wealth between the few and the many, I mean many, is so entrenched that such external force is no longer necessary. Thus comes the great freedom and equality before the law, which Ben believes is sufficient enough for the enterprising poor man to transform his state of personal dependency through savings. But how does the poor man do this? In most cases of upward mobility, we rarely see Franklin's advice unfold in true form. The budding entrepreneur story gets a loan from a wealthy patron, or from a bank, or a government grant, some external holder of capital, and works his ass off to try turning it into profit. Most do not succeed, and those who do triumph do so through a combination of personal network and luck that is unique to a given individual and his circumstances, something that is beneath the scope of a universal proverb. Invariably, whenever we find the successful spitting out advice like Franklin's, he'll emphasize the poverty of his beginnings and his own hard work, but not the initial loan that gave him his start, with family, fraternity, governmental or institutional connections, or the racial advantages that opened a social door denied to others. Because, in the last analysis, capital accumulation is a social activity. One's success is determined by one's social position, and I guarantee you will not find many examples of upward mobility that go a few steps beyond their point of origin. Which brings us back to social welfare. Does it create dependency? Is it just a crutch for the lazy? The problem is that so many of said dependents are physically incapable of becoming the autonomous actors demanded in Franklin's worldview. The elderly, the handicapped, the mentally ill, the drug dependent, children are now considered unemployable in a humane society. The enemy of welfare will tell you that of course he's all for assistance to the truly needy. He doesn't like seeing kids go hungry, old ladies eating cat food or their cats, or legless people begging on the street curb, though he might not mind seeing them forced to sell flowers in a street corner to survive. That is enterprising. That is fulfilling Ben's proverb. So does selling drugs, but that means access to real capital, so it must therefore be deemed immoral. That is only for the wealthy black marketeer. The critic of public welfare fails to grasp its essentially conservative nature. The social programs associated in the U.S. with the New Deal were conceived in fear of a real social revolution and the greatest capitalist crisis in history. Forcing Ben's philosophy down the throats of the hungry was leading them to puke it up and seek sustenance outside the system, in a growing communist party, and populists like Huey Long, in socialism, even in fascism. The long-term threat to property and capital by the pie-in-the-sky defenders of both required someone to step outside the box and give the masses some symbolic gesture, other than this, that they still possessed social value. The same was true in the 1960s with the growth of the Great Society entitlements, a response to the Great Ghetto Insurrections. As former sharecroppers freed from dependency, thanks to the collapse of the cotton system, they came looking north, looking for Ben's window of opportunity, and found it faced a brick wall in someone else's slum. No barrier in Berlin ever rivaled the sense of entrapment in America's great cities. The battering at the walls of property moved those in power to opening a way around this wall for its larger self-preservation, which means that Ben Franklin might have something after all. To keep the poor dependent on welfare does indeed rob them of the energy and initiative to break down the walls of poverty, that is, dependence on property and capital, in ways that are meaningful to them. It does inhibit the need to work together, to form unions, community networks, to organize protests, to initiate rebellions, to commence revolutions that break down the bonds of oppressive dependency. The right-wing fools who misappropriate Ben's quotation fail to grasp that welfare is the real barrier between them and the social order that will transform property into the common welfare of all, or into rubble. Uh-oh, seems Google Plus can't filter out these crank two-blind calls. Hello? Who? Vladimir Ilyich? You mean Lenin? God damn, is the number written on every bathroom wall? Tombs too, eh? I just want to say that you agree with the libertarians in the U.S., with the teabaggers and Rush Limbaugh and all the rest. Social welfare is the modern opiate of the masses, and dismantling the liberal bourgeois welfare state, making the poor desperate, just like Ben advised, is the surest way of destroying the very capital with its face on it. No wonder they called you the evil genius of revolution. What's that? You weren't really so smart? The other side was just so friggin' stupid? Why not make them pay for it?